Sarah Chen's Tuesday morning routine had become sacred over the past 3 years of working from home. Coffee first, always Ethiopian blend, ground fresh. Check emails while the apartment filled with the rich aroma. Then settle into her makeshift office corner, surrounded by design sketches and the gentle hum of her high-end computer. At 28, she'd built a comfortable freelance career in graphic design, her clients ranging from local restaurants to tech startups. Her downtown apartment offered the perfect balance of urban energy and creative solitude, with large windows that flooded her workspace with natural light. This particular Tuesday felt no different as she opened her laptop, responding to a client's feedback about their logo design. The coffee was perfect, her playlist was hitting all the right notes, and she had that satisfying feeling of productivity that came with tackling her to-do list early. She was deep in concentration, adjusting color gradients and typography, when the piercing screech of the emergency broadcast system cut through her music like a knife. The automated voice was clinical, almost bored, as it announced civil unrest in the downtown area and advised residents to remain indoors until further notice. Sarah frowned, pausing her work to glance toward the window. The street below looked normal enough, a few pedestrians, some morning traffic, nothing unusual. She was about to dismiss it as another false alarm when her phone erupted with notifications. Text after text from Emma, her younger sister who worked as a nurse at City General Hospital. The messages came rapid fire, each one more frantic than the last. Sarah, something's happening here. Patients are attacking staff. This isn't normal. People are sick but not sick, they're violent. Don't go outside. I mean it, Sarah, lock your doors. Then abruptly silence. Sarah stared at her phone screen, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She tried calling Emma back, but the call went straight to voicemail. Again and again the same result. A knot of anxiety formed in her stomach as she moved to her fourth-floor window, pushing aside the sheer curtains to get a better view of Main Street below. What she saw made her blood run cold. The normal flow of pedestrian traffic had devolved into chaos. People were running in all directions, some screaming, others moving with an odd, shambling gait that seemed almost mechanical. A businessman in what had once been an expensive suit was pursuing a woman down the sidewalk, but his movements were wrong, too stiff, too determined, like a predator stalking prey. His shirt was torn and stained with something dark, and when he caught the woman, Sarah witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The woman's screams pierced the morning air before cutting off with terrifying suddenness. Sarah stumbled backward from the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her rational mind struggled to process what she'd witnessed, searching for logical explanations that simply didn't exist. She grabbed the remote and cycled through news channels, but half were displaying emergency broadcasts or had gone offline entirely. The channels still broadcasting showed similar scenes of inexplicable violence erupting across the city. Reporters struggled to maintain their composure as they described unprecedented civil unrest and mass psychotic episodes, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't understand what was happening any more than she did. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment made her freeze. Someone was moving from door to door, and with each stop came the sound of violent pounding and inhuman vocalizations. Sarah crept to her peephole and peered out, her blood turning to ice. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor who had always been kind and gentle, was standing in the hallway covered in blood, her gray hair matted and wild. But it was her eyes that terrified Sarah most. They were vacant, empty of any recognition or humanity. The old woman's hands were bloodied and torn as she pounded on doors with mechanical persistence, making sounds that no human throat should produce. Sarah backed away from the door, her mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was spreading through her building and she was trapped. She moved quickly but quietly, dragging her heavy dining table across the hardwood floor to barricade the door. The couch followed, then her bookshelf, creating a makeshift fortress in her own home. She turned off all the lights, drew the curtains, and sat in the darkness of her living room, clutching the largest knife from her kitchen drawer. Outside, the sounds of civilization were being replaced by something far more sinister, a low, collective moaning that seemed to rise from the very streets themselves. Sarah had no way of knowing that she was witnessing the beginning of humanity's darkest chapter, or that her comfortable life was about to become a desperate fight for survival that would test every fiber of her being. The second day brought no relief, only the crushing realization that help wasn't coming. Sarah had spent the night huddled in her bathroom, the only room without windows, listening to the sounds of her building falling apart around her. The moaning had grown louder, more persistent, and she could hear doors splintering somewhere below. Her phone had lost signal entirely, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. By dawn, the pounding on her door had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse than the noise. She carefully moved her barricade just enough to peer through the peephole and immediately wished she hadn't. The hallway was painted with dark stains, and Mrs. Patterson's body lay motionless near the elevator, though Sarah couldn't tell if she was dead or simply dormant. The emergency stairwell seemed to be her only chance, but reaching it meant crossing 30 feet of exposed hallway. Sarah spent hours preparing, filling her hiking backpack with water bottles, energy bars, her phone charger, and a small first aid kit. She changed into her running shoes and darkest clothes, reasoning that stealth was now more valuable than comfort. The kitchen yielded 2 sharp knives, which she secured to her belt with dish towels. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she made her move. The hallway reeked of something she didn't want to identify, and every step on the old wooden floor seemed to echo like thunder. She was halfway to the stairwell when she heard it, a wet, shuffling sound coming from the apartment at the end of the hall. Mr. Rodriguez, her friendly neighbor who always helped with her groceries, emerged from his doorway, but he was no longer the man she knew. His postal uniform was torn and stained, and his usual warm smile had been replaced by something hungry and terrible. Sarah ran, her footsteps pounding against the floor as she burst through the stairwell door. The echo of her movement seemed to awaken something in the building, and suddenly the moaning resumed with renewed intensity. She descended 2 floors before encountering her first real obstacle: 3 infected people clustered on the landing, their heads turning toward her with mechanical precision. Sarah's heart hammered as she gripped her knife, but she knew fighting wasn't an option. Instead, she threw her water bottle down the opposite stairwell, and when they shambled toward the sound, she slipped past them and continued her desperate descent. The ground floor exit was blocked by debris and what looked like barricading furniture, forcing her toward the basement parking garage. The darkness down there was absolute, broken only by the dim glow of emergency lighting. Sarah used her phone's flashlight sparingly, knowing the battery was precious. She found her car, but the garage door was sealed shut, and the infected were beginning to filter down from above, drawn by her earlier commotion. In a moment of desperation, she remembered the old maintenance tunnel that connected to the building next door, a relic from the 1940s that the landlord had mentioned during her initial tour. The tunnel was narrow, dusty, and terrifying, but it was her only chance. She crawled through the suffocating darkness, her backpack scraping against the concrete walls, until she emerged in the adjacent building's basement. This building seemed quieter, but Sarah knew that quiet could be deceptive. She made her way to the lobby, where broken glass and overturned furniture told the story of recent chaos. The street outside was a wasteland of abandoned cars and wandering figures, but Sarah spotted something that made her heart leap: a small corner store across the street with its metal security gates still intact. If she could reach it, she might find food and temporary shelter. As night fell on day 2, Sarah prepared for the most dangerous part of her escape yet, knowing that the infected seemed more active in the darkness, and that every shadow could hide a threat that would end her fight for survival before it had truly begun. The corner store became Sarah's lifeline, though getting there nearly cost her everything. She had waited until the darkest hour before dawn, when the infected seemed sluggish and less responsive. The sprint across the street was the longest 20 seconds of her life, dodging abandoned cars and the outstretched arms of wandering figures who moved like sleepwalkers having nightmares. The store's owner, Mr. Kim, had been thorough in his security preparations, and Sarah found herself safe behind reinforced metal gates and thick glass windows. The store was a treasure trove of supplies: canned goods, bottled water, basic medical supplies, and even a small camping stove. More importantly, it had a small apartment above it where Mr. Kim had lived, complete with a bed, bathroom, and a radio that occasionally picked up emergency broadcasts. Sarah learned that the infection had spread beyond the city, with reports coming in from across the country. The government had declared martial law, but the broadcasts grew more sporadic each day, and the last one she heard mentioned safe zones being established in rural areas. For 3 days, Sarah made the store her fortress, carefully rationing supplies and learning the patterns of the infected outside. They were drawn to sound and movement, but they seemed almost dormant during the day, clustering in shadows and doorways. She discovered that they couldn't climb well, which explained why the apartment above felt relatively safe. During this time, she also encountered her first other survivor, a teenage boy named Marcus who had been hiding in the store's storage room when she arrived. He was perhaps 16, scared and hungry, but he had valuable information about the surrounding area. Marcus told her about a group of survivors who had taken refuge in Jefferson High School, about 2 miles away. The school was built like a fortress, with high fences and multiple buildings that could be secured. More importantly, they had established radio contact with other survivor groups and were working together to create a network of safe zones. Sarah felt hope for the first time since the outbreak began, but reaching the school would require crossing the most dangerous part of the city, where the infected seemed to congregate in larger numbers. On the fourth day, Sarah and Marcus began planning their escape from the store. They had noticed a pattern in the infected's behavior. They were more active at night but became almost catatonic during the hottest part of the day. They decided to make their move during the noon hour, when the sun was at its peak and the streets were at their quietest. Sarah fashioned weapons from store materials, a mop handle sharpened to a point, and a hammer from the maintenance kit. Marcus had found a baseball bat in the sporting goods section, though Sarah hoped they wouldn't need to use any of their makeshift weapons. They loaded backpacks with essential supplies, leaving the rest behind with heavy hearts. The journey to Jefferson High would take them through 3 distinct zones. The commercial district where they currently were, a residential area that reports suggested was heavily infected, and finally the school district where they hoped to find safety. Sarah had studied the route obsessively, memorizing every alley, every potential hiding spot, every building that might offer refuge if things went wrong. As they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary, Sarah felt a mix of terror and determination. She had survived the first few days when so many others hadn't, and she was no longer the same person who had been designing logos just a week ago. The apocalypse had awakened something in her, a fierce will to survive that she never knew she possessed. But as they prepared to step back into the infected world, she also realized that the real challenges were just beginning, and that finding other survivors might bring new dangers she hadn't yet imagined. The journey to Jefferson High School should have taken 2 hours, but it stretched into 2 days of nightmare navigation through a city that no longer resembled the place Sarah had called home. She and Marcus moved from shadow to shadow, using abandoned cars as cover and communicating only through hand signals they had hastily developed. The residential district was worse than the reports had suggested. Entire families of infected wandered their former neighborhoods, and the sight of children among them nearly broke Sarah's resolve. They took refuge in an abandoned pharmacy on the first night, sharing a cold can of beans and speaking in whispers about their hopes for the school. Marcus told her about his younger sister who had been at a sleepover when the outbreak began, and how he hoped she had made it to safety. Sarah shared stories about Emma, though she had long since accepted that her sister was probably gone. When they finally reached Jefferson High, Sarah felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. The school was indeed fortified, with vehicles blocking the main entrances and makeshift watchtowers constructed from classroom furniture. A guard spotted them approaching and, after a tense verification process, welcomed them inside. The school had become home to nearly 40 survivors, led by a former Army sergeant named David Torres who had been visiting his daughter when the outbreak began. The group had established a functioning community with assigned roles, meal schedules and security protocols. Sarah was assigned to the communications team, using her technical skills to maintain their radio equipment and help coordinate with other survivor groups. For the first time since the outbreak, she felt safe enough to sleep through the night. However, the idyllic community atmosphere began to crack within days of their arrival. Resources were becoming scarce, and tensions were rising between different factions within the group. Torres ran the community with military efficiency, but some survivors felt his leadership was becoming increasingly authoritarian. A school teacher named Janet Morrison had begun questioning every decision, arguing that they needed to be more democratic in their approach. The real trouble began when a supply run went wrong. A team of 6 survivors, including Marcus, had ventured into the city to raid a medical supply warehouse. Only 3 returned, and they brought disturbing news. They had been ambushed not by infected, but by another group of survivors who had been systematically raiding their supply runs. Marcus had been captured, along with 2 others, and the attacking group had demanded that Jefferson High surrender half of their supplies in exchange for the hostages. Torres wanted to mount a rescue operation, but Morrison argued that they couldn't risk more lives. The debate split the community down the middle, with some survivors packing their belongings and preparing to leave rather than get caught in what they saw as an inevitable conflict. Sarah found herself caught between loyalty to Marcus, who had become like a younger brother to her, and the harsh reality that a rescue mission might doom them all. The situation deteriorated further when they discovered that someone within their own group had been providing information to the raiders about their supply runs and security measures. The revelation that there was a traitor among them shattered the trust that had held the community together. Accusations flew, friendships dissolved, and the school that had felt like sanctuary became a pressure cooker of suspicion and paranoia. Torres implemented strict security measures, including searches of personal belongings and restricted movement within the school, but this only made tensions worse. Sarah realized that human nature might be more dangerous than the infected outside, and that the skills she had learned for surviving zombies might not be enough to survive other survivors. On the 12th day, everything fell apart. A heated argument between Torres and Morrison escalated into a physical confrontation, and in the chaos that followed, someone opened the main gate. Whether it was an accident or sabotage, the result was the same: infected poured into the school courtyard, and the community that had taken weeks to build was destroyed in minutes. Sarah found herself running once again, this time from both the infected and the collapse of everything she had hoped would be her salvation. The collapse of Jefferson High left Sarah more alone than she had ever been in her life. She had escaped the chaos with nothing but her backpack and the clothes on her back, leaving behind the radio equipment that had become her lifeline to the outside world. The infected had overrun the school so quickly that she barely had time to grab her essential supplies before climbing through a second-story window and dropping into the parking lot. She could hear screams and gunfire behind her as she ran, but she didn't look back. The city was no longer safe for anyone, and Sarah made the difficult decision to head toward the rural areas where the last government broadcasts had mentioned safe zones. The journey took her through abandoned suburbs where nature was already beginning to reclaim the streets. Weeds pushed through sidewalk cracks and wild animals had begun venturing into areas they had never explored before. Sarah discovered that the infected were less common in these areas, but they were also more dangerous because they moved individually rather than in predictable groups. A lone infected person could appear anywhere, and without the safety of numbers, every encounter was potentially fatal. She learned to move like a ghost, sleeping in different locations each night and never staying in one place for more than a few hours. During this period, Sarah's survival skills reached their peak. She learned to find water by following animal tracks, to identify edible plants from a field guide she found in an abandoned bookstore, and to create fire without matches using techniques she had only read about online. The solitude was both a blessing and a curse. While she didn't have to worry about other people's decisions getting her killed, the isolation began to wear on her mental health. She started talking to herself, then to an imaginary companion she named Hope, who helped her work through problems and make decisions. The physical challenges were immense, but the psychological toll was worse. Sarah found herself questioning whether survival was worth the constant fear and loneliness. She had lost weight, her hands were permanently stained and cut from scavenging, and she had developed a nervous habit of checking over her shoulder every few seconds. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it was filled with nightmares of infected faces and the screams of people she couldn't save. On the 15th day, Sarah encountered something that changed everything: a small farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney. Her first instinct was to avoid it, as her experience at the school had taught her that other survivors could be more dangerous than the infected. But as she watched from the treeline, she saw a woman hanging laundry on a line, and the sight was so beautifully normal that it brought tears to her eyes. The woman was alone, middle-aged, and moved with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to survive. Sarah debated for hours whether to approach, weighing her desperate need for human contact against the very real possibility that this person might be hostile. Finally, her loneliness won out, and she approached the farmhouse with her hands visible and empty. The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth, was a former park ranger who had been living alone since her husband died in the initial outbreak. She had turned her farm into a fortress of sorts, with early warning systems made from cans and string, and a deep knowledge of the surrounding wilderness. Ruth was suspicious at first, but Sarah's obvious exhaustion and genuine gratitude for a hot meal gradually won her over. For 2 days, Sarah experienced something she had almost forgotten: peace. Ruth's farmhouse was hidden in a valley with natural barriers that kept the infected away, and for the first time since the outbreak, Sarah felt truly safe. They shared stories, worked together to improve the farm's defenses, and Sarah even helped Ruth with some mechanical repairs using skills she had learned from watching YouTube videos in her old life. But on the 18th day, their sanctuary was discovered. Sarah woke to Ruth shaking her urgently, whispering that she had heard vehicles approaching. Through the window they could see headlights in the distance, and the sound of engines carrying across the quiet valley. Ruth grabbed a hunting rifle and told Sarah to pack quickly. They had maybe 10 minutes before whoever was coming would arrive. Sarah realized with growing horror that their smoke signals and normal activities had betrayed their location to someone who might not have friendly intentions. As they prepared to flee into the wilderness, Sarah understood that her period of solitude was ending, but what lay ahead might be even more dangerous than anything she had faced alone. The vehicles that had terrified Sarah and Ruth turned out to be the best thing that had happened to either of them since the outbreak began. The convoy belonged to a group called the Mountain View Settlement, led by a former emergency management coordinator named Patricia Wells who had been organizing survivors in the rural areas for weeks. Unlike the military-style hierarchy at Jefferson High, Patricia's group operated more like a small-town government, with elected representatives and democratic decision-making processes. They had been following smoke signals and radio chatter, actively searching for isolated survivors to bring into their community. Ruth initially resisted joining them, having grown attached to her solitary life, but Sarah convinced her that their small group would be stronger together. The settlement was located in a former summer camp nestled in a mountain valley, with natural barriers on 3 sides and only one easily defended access road. The camp's existing infrastructure, dining hall, cabins, medical facility, and workshop areas, had been perfect for conversion into a functioning town. Nearly 200 survivors had gathered there, including families with children, elderly people, and individuals with valuable skills like doctors, teachers, and engineers. Sarah was amazed to discover that the settlement had not only survived but was actually thriving. They had established gardens, a water purification system, and even a small school for the children. The infected were rare in the mountainous terrain, and the few that wandered into the area were quickly dealt with by organized patrol teams. For the first time since the outbreak, Sarah felt like she was part of something bigger than mere survival. She was part of rebuilding civilization. Sarah was assigned to the communications team, where her technical background proved invaluable in maintaining contact with other survivor groups across the region. She learned that there were dozens of similar communities scattered throughout the mountains, all working together to share resources and information. The settlement had even established trade relationships with some groups, exchanging medical supplies for food or tools for ammunition. Patricia Wells proved to be exactly the kind of leader that the survivors needed, pragmatic but compassionate, organized but not authoritarian. She had created a council system where major decisions were voted on by representatives from different areas of the settlement. Sarah found herself elected to represent the communications and technical teams, and for the first time in weeks she felt like she had a voice in her own destiny. The settlement's success bred confidence, and Sarah began to believe that they might actually rebuild something better than what they had lost. The children were learning not just academic subjects but practical skills like farming, basic medicine, and wilderness survival. The adults were developing new friendships and even romantic relationships. There was laughter again and music in the evenings, and the kind of casual conversations that had seemed impossible during the early days of the outbreak. But Sarah's experience at Jefferson High had taught her to be wary of too much optimism. She noticed small signs of tension, complaints about work assignments, disagreements over resource allocation, and the formation of unofficial cliques within the larger community. More concerning was the arrival of new groups of survivors who brought stories of increasing organization among hostile survivor factions in the lower elevations. These groups had evolved from simple raiders into something more dangerous, militarized communities that survived by conquest rather than cooperation. On the 22nd day, those concerns became reality when a reconnaissance team returned with disturbing news. A large group of well-armed survivors had been systematically taking over smaller communities in the valley below, demanding tribute and enslaving those who resisted. They called themselves the New Republic, and their scouts had been spotted in the area around Mountain View. Patricia called an emergency council meeting, and the debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the settlement. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to negotiate, and still others wanted to pack up and flee deeper into the mountains. Sarah found herself caught between her desire to protect the community that had given her hope and her hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the best survival strategy was to run. The decision became urgent when the settlement's radio operators intercepted communications indicating that the New Republic was planning to move against them within days. As the 23rd day dawned, Sarah realized that her peaceful interlude was about to end, and that the settlement's greatest test was about to begin. The question was no longer whether they could survive the infected, but whether they could survive other survivors who had chosen conquest over cooperation as their path through the apocalypse. The New Republic's assault on Mountain View settlement began before dawn on the 24th day, with mortar fire that shattered the peaceful morning and sent everyone scrambling for the emergency positions they had hoped never to use. Sarah found herself in the communications bunker, frantically trying to coordinate with other settlements while explosions rocked the camp around her. The attackers had come in greater numbers than anyone had anticipated, nearly 100 armed fighters in military-style vehicles, led by a former colonel named Marcus Vaughn who had transformed survivor desperation into a conquering army. Patricia Wells proved her leadership under fire, calmly directing the defense while keeping the civilian population safe in the reinforced dining hall that had been converted into a shelter. The settlement's defenders numbered only 40 adults with combat experience, but they had the advantage of knowing every trail, every hiding spot, and every defensive position in their mountain valley. Sarah watched through the bunker's periscope as Ruth, armed with her hunting rifle, picked off attackers with the deadly precision of someone who had spent decades tracking wildlife. The first day of battle was chaos, with the New Republic forces trying to storm the main camp while the settlement's defenders used guerrilla tactics to harass them from the surrounding forests. Sarah's communication skills proved crucial as she coordinated with other settlements, calling for reinforcements and sharing intelligence about the attackers' movements. By evening, both sides had taken casualties, but the settlement still held the high ground. The night brought a temporary ceasefire, and Sarah found herself helping in the medical facility, where she saw the true cost of their resistance. Friends and neighbors lay wounded, some critically, and the reality of their situation became clear. They might win this battle, but they couldn't survive a prolonged siege. Dr. Martinez, the settlement's physician, worked tirelessly to save lives while supplies of medical equipment dwindled rapidly. The second day brought a new strategy from Vaughn's forces. They had captured the settlement's water source and were using it as leverage to demand surrender. Patricia called an emergency council meeting in the underground bunker, and the debate was heated. Some argued for surrender to save lives, others wanted to fight to the death, and a few suggested attempting to break through the enemy lines and escape. Sarah found herself thinking of Marcus, the young man who had been captured at Jefferson High, and realized that sometimes the hardest survival decisions involved choosing what you were willing to die for. The breakthrough came when Sarah made contact with a coalition of settlements that had been coordinating a response to the New Republic's expansion. 3 other communities had sent their best fighters, and they were planning a coordinated counterattack that would hit Vaughn's forces from multiple directions. The plan required Mountain View to hold out for one more day while maintaining the illusion that they were weakening. Sarah volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission, using her technical skills to hack into the New Republic's radio communications and provide real-time intelligence to the coalition forces. The third day of battle was the longest of Sarah's life. She spent it in an advanced observation post, intercepting enemy communications while dodging sniper fire and calling in precise coordinates for the coalition's attacks. The final assault came at sunset, with friendly forces attacking from 3 directions while the settlement's defenders launched their own counterattack from the camp. The battle was fierce but brief, with Vaughn's forces caught completely off guard by the coordinated assault. Sarah watched through her scope as the colonel himself fell, brought down by Ruth's rifle during his attempt to escape. The victory came at a heavy price. The settlement had lost 12 defenders, including some of Sarah's closest friends from the council. But they had also dealt a decisive blow to the New Republic's expansion, and the other settlements in the region were finally safe from their predations. More importantly, they had proven that cooperation could triumph over conquest, that democracy could survive even in the darkest times. As the 27th day ended, Sarah stood in the ruins of the camp that had been her home, surrounded by the evidence of both destruction and victory. The settlement would rebuild, stronger than before, but she realized that her journey was far from over. The infected were still out there and there would always be new threats to face. But for the first time since the outbreak began, she felt like humanity had a fighting chance, and that the future might hold something better than mere survival. The final 3 days of Sarah's first month in the post-apocalyptic world were unlike anything she could have imagined when she first barricaded herself in her apartment. The victory over the New Republic had transformed not just Mountain View settlement, but the entire region's approach to survival. Representatives from a dozen communities gathered at the camp to form what they called the Mountain Alliance, a mutual defense pact and trade network that would ensure no single settlement would ever face such a threat alone. Sarah found herself elected as the Alliance's first communications coordinator, a role that would require her to travel between settlements and maintain the radio networks that kept them connected. On the 28th day, as cleanup crews worked to repair the damage from the battle, Sarah received a message that stopped her heart. A crackling voice over the radio, weak but unmistakable, it was Marcus, the young man who had been captured during the Jefferson High supply run. He was alive, held in a New Republic labor camp 2 valleys over, along with dozens of other prisoners from conquered settlements. The defeat of Vaughn's main force had left the camp lightly guarded, and Patricia immediately authorized a rescue mission. Sarah volunteered to lead the communications aspect of the operation, her skills now honed by months of survival and battle. The rescue mission launched on the 29th day, with Sarah coordinating between 3 teams as they approached the labor camp from different directions. Using the intelligence-gathering techniques she had learned during the battle, she identified guard positions and patrol patterns, then guided the rescue teams to optimal positions. The operation was a complete success. They freed 43 prisoners including Marcus without firing a single shot. The reunion with Marcus was emotional beyond words, but what struck Sarah most was how much they had both changed. The scared teenager she had met in the corner store had become a resilient young man who had helped organize resistance within the camp. He told her stories of how the prisoners had supported each other, shared resources, and maintained hope even in the darkest circumstances. His survival had depended not just on individual strength, but on the same cooperation and community spirit that had saved Mountain View Settlement. As the 30th day dawned, Sarah stood on the observation deck that had been rebuilt on the camp's highest point, looking out over the valley that had become her home. The settlement bustled with activity as people prepared for winter, expanded the gardens, and welcomed the rescued prisoners into their community. Children played in areas that had been battlefields just days before, their laughter echoing off the mountains like a promise that life would continue. Ruth approached her with 2 cups of real coffee, a luxury that had arrived with the latest trade convoy from a settlement that had managed to secure a coffee plantation. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over peaks that no longer seemed threatening but protective. Sarah reflected on the person she had been 30 days ago, a graphic designer worried about client deadlines and apartment rent. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different world entirely. The Sarah who stood here now was scarred, hardened, but also stronger and more purposeful than she had ever been. She had discovered reserves of courage, intelligence, and leadership that she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she had learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about preserving the things that made life worth living. Community, cooperation, hope, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The infected were still out there, winter was coming, and there would always be new challenges to face. But Sarah no longer faced them alone. She was part of something larger now, something that could grow and thrive and maybe even flourish. The Mountain Alliance was planning to establish a school system, restart manufacturing of essential goods, and even begin exploratory missions to contact survivor communities in distant regions. Patricia had asked Sarah to lead a team that would document their experiences and create a survival manual for future settlements. It was ambitious, maybe even impossible, but 30 days ago Sarah would have said the same thing about surviving a zombie apocalypse. As she finished her coffee and prepared to start another day of building the future, Sarah Chin smiled. Something she hadn't done genuinely since before the outbreak. She had not just survived the first 30 days of the zombie apocalypse. She had discovered who she truly was when everything else was stripped away. And that person was someone who could help build a world worth living in, one day at a time.